I've sent you 3 papers to read rather than the one that we were requested to send in for this particular conference. But the first is a paper that Charles published at the start of this year on historical reasons for the UK focus on broad money, and that did really set the UK apart from countries such as the US and Germany, which tended to focus on narrower measures of the money supply, and I'll explain the deeper historical reasons for why that was. It became obvious to me last night in the discussion that this is the period, particularly the earlier period in the interaction with the IMF, I think that's part of the story that's less well known. So the later part is better known, and that second part is competition credit control. That's a paper I published about 3 years ago, and then there's a chapter of this book on the medium-term financial strategy. But I think that's part of the story that's better known. So I will comment briefly towards the end of my remarks on competition credit control, but I think I'll focus in the limited time available on the earlier period, because I think that's, as I say, that's the period that's less well known. Why were the British authorities traditionally focused on a broader measure of money supply? I'm not going to read out all of these quotes because they're effectively saying exactly the same thing. In 1861, I'm drawing upon some of the work that Forrester did in the early 80s here, Walter Bagehot, in the pages of The Economist, wrote to all or suggested that the joint stock banks might wish to submit details of their balance sheets. Some of them did, some of them didn't. They were under no compulsion to do so. And what Bagehot requested was that they break down their deposits into current accounts, instant access accounts, and deposit accounts. Some of them did, some of them didn't, some didn't bother to respond. But what The Economist newspaper then did was publish a half-yearly banking survey, and it continued to publish this, and this is one of the earliest pieces of evidence we've got for the size of the UK banking system. But it's hardly with us. One of Bagehot's successors at The Economist newspaper pointed out in his evidence to the US National Monetary Commission, that ultimately leads to the foundation of the Federal Reserve, says that the customer wished to remove deposit funds immediately, very few bankers would refuse to permit him to do so. And you can see through that series of quotes, and that remains largely the case for British banking throughout the period. Right through to the evidence of the Radcliffe Committee from the National Institute, deposit accounts and joint stock banks restricted or transferred in such that the accounts can be regarded as de facto transferable without restriction. So the point of all this is that the division between current accounts, which we think of as M1, a narrow monetary measure, and M3 in this country has always been more porous than it is elsewhere. And this is not only from the bank's perspective, but also from the authorities' perspective. So when the cash ratio is formalised in 1946, the bank's always been working to informal cash ratios, but when that cash ratio is formalised in 1946, it is applied to aggregate deposits. There is no attempt, as there is in Germany and the United States, to apply a different reserve ratio to current accounts and deposit accounts. So the authorities are very much following a traditional banking practice, which is not to differentiate between current accounts and deposit accounts. And that's the same when the liquidity ratio is formalised in 1951. So regulation always applies to deposit accounts in total, and that leads you down the path of looking at a broad money measure rather than M1. I'll come back to that. Now, another reason is the growth of the flow of funds and the credit counterparts approach that was mentioned earlier on. And this is where monetary policy really blends in with the approach to national income accounting that was developed during and immediately after the Second World War. There's a slightly lengthy description of what flow of funds accounting means. This is from a Bank of England publication in 1972. And there's the definition, the counterparts definition of the growth of the broad money supply M3. Now what this does is it shows you if there's a monetary impulse in the economy, you want to know where it's coming from, because your policy response it needs to be tailored to where the monetary impulse is coming from. So we touched on this already in the first session. The monetary impulse could be coming from the public printing press. It could be coming from an increasingly unfunded public sector borrowing requirement. That's going to dictate a certain policy response. It could be coming from fountain pen money, bank lending to the private sector, or it could be coming through the balance of payments from overseas. So the flow of funds, the credit counterparts approach that's developed in the 1950s, is very much an adjunct to the national income approach, and a more sophisticated way of looking, where is that monetary impulse, if there is one, where is it coming from? Now this gains impetus in the 1956 budget, the only one that Harold Macmillan delivered, where he said that some of our financial statistics are basically not fit for purpose. It's rather like looking at a train in last year's Bradshaw. Bradshaw being the railway timetables that have been published since the Victorian era. So the statistics were often out of date, and they were rather patchy. So there's a big push within Whitehall from 1956 onwards to improve the quality of UK financial statistics, and it's all wrapped up in this project to increase the information, the timing and the quality of the information that's available to show that monetary impulses going from different sectors of the economy. And the Radcliffe Committee gets very excited about this. There's a lovely letter from, and I believe it's Robert Armstrong, who's Secretary of the Radcliffe Committee, to, I can't remember who in the Bank of England, that says the reason the Radcliffe Committee focuses so much on statistical recommendations, particularly the collection of better money supply data, is they can't find anything to disagree on. That it did actually reflect the consensus of the time. Now, I know some economists will disagree with this reaction from some economists at the time, but they couldn't really find anything new to say. This is Robert Armstrong saying this, so they devoted a lot of their space in the report to statistical recommendations, most of which came from the National Institute. Now, you could have a flow of funds, credit counterparts approach based on narrow money, essentially based on an M1 measure, but that is going to require you to have some sort of view on the transfer of money from current accounts and deposit accounts. And as we've seen, going back to the Victorian banking era, that's not something you can predict in the UK, given the way that the financial system is set up. Now, this focus on broad money leads the UK monetary authorities on a collision course with the IMF. And I'm just going to develop some of the thoughts that Charles touched on earlier on. The IMF has been publishing effectively what we call the Macmillan data. These are the deposit accounts and the current accounts of the London clearing banks since 1948 in its International Financial Statistics publication. What it does in early 1955 is it tries to standardise its presentation of monetary data across all its member countries. And the IMF's definition of money is a narrow definition of money. So it turns around to the UK and says, we are going to define your money supply as the liabilities of the central bank and the current accounts of the London clearing banks, not the deposit accounts. This leads to a great deal of consternation within the Bank of England and the opening salvos of what the bank statisticians refer to as the 7 Years' War with the IMF. There is a huge amount of toing and froing. The IMF's chief statistician, a chap called Earl Hicks, certainly comes through the archives as a particularly prickly character who is, at one point he says, why don't I just come to London and thrash all this out with you, and the bank said, please don't. Because he's a very difficult character. So there's about 7 years of thrashing this backwards and forwards. Now, first reason Bank of England doesn't like this is because of what I mentioned, the porous divide between current accounts and deposit accounts in this country. The second is the exchange equalisation account. Now, it takes the IMF literally 13 years to work out how the exchange equalisation account operates. So I'm not going to try and do it in a few minutes here, except to say that with sterling as a reserve currency, stuff is going through the exchange equalisation account that may have very little or nothing to do with the UK economy. If you've got another sterling area country doing a transaction with a second sterling area country, if an Australian company is buying, I don't know, oil from Saudi Arabia, that could generate a monetary, it could see an increase or a decrease in the exchange equalisation account that's got absolutely nothing to do with the UK economy. And the Bank of England says, you don't understand this, the sterling is a reserve currency, there are all sorts of things going through the exchange equalisation account, and the treasuries are going up and down to fund the exchange equalisation account, and this might have little or no impact on the UK economy. So we shouldn't include this in the UK banking sector. The IMF is looking particularly at the French and the Americans, where the reserves sit on the central bank's balance sheet. Now, for historical reasons, going back to the foundation of the exchange equalisation account in 1932, the exchange equalisation account is not owned by the bank, it's owned by the Treasury and managed by the bank. And the bank does not wish to reveal information about what's going on there. Now, the other reason that the bank is very exercised about this is because the IMF wishes to include the bank's issue department in its data, standardised data publication of international financial statistics. That is going to reveal precisely how much government support, bank support, has been given to bond issue, gilt issues that haven't gone particularly well. So how much of the Daltons are still sitting on the Bank of England's balance sheet, for instance, from the late 1940s? And Morris Allen's got this very nice quote: the IMF has to be in a position to give the analysis of the proximate cause of the change in multiplier. They need to know more than we would want to tell them. It's going to materially impact on the bank's ability to exercise monetary policy through management of the national debt. Now, the Bank of England wins this 7 years war, and the IMF continues to define the British money supply in broad terms. This is a battle that is won by the British authorities. Now, why is any of this important? Well, as Charles said earlier on, it's because of conditionality. But basically, the IMF agrees in 1962 that when it comes to definitions of the money supply, for UK purposes, it will be the broad measure that is in tune with British banking practice going back to the Victorian era. So that's agreed in 1962. This is important because the UK is the heaviest user of IMF resources in that institution's first 30 years of existence. Despite what our previous Chancellor said, 1976 was not the first time that an industrialised nation had been to the IMF to borrow. We went to 48, 56, 61, 64, 65, 68, 69. 72 is the one that everybody forgets about, when the Heath government drew down the gold tranche of our IMF quota to pay for the failed support operations in June 1972 when the pound fell out of the European currency state. We had to pay back the French and Germans and everybody else who helped us support the pound. We drew from the IMF's gold tranche in 72. We went in 76 twice, and that 77 drawing is the drawing of the December 1977 loan. The joke, not a particularly funny joke, was that the IMF headquarters in downtown Washington was built on the proceeds of UK loans. We were the biggest, most frequent borrower from the IMF in the post-war period. Now, this becomes especially important after October 1968, because Britain gets away pretty much scot-free in November 1967 with the $1.4 billion that we borrowed at the time of devaluation. Very low conditionality is attached to that, practically none, in fact. And this infuriates the developing nations, because when the IMF goes to Latin America, when they lend to Paraguay, Brazil, whoever it may be, strict conditions are applied generally to the growth of the central bank's balance sheet, as Charles mentioned earlier on. This is the Treasury's attitude to this. Is a rather nice quote. I don't know who it was, but it was a letter to a chap called Stennis Ricketts. It would be repugnant to the dignity of the country of the UK's status to have conditionality attached to loans. And Sir Adam described this in a talk he gave in Hedrick a few years ago as, Britain's one of the prefects of the IMF. It's not embarrassing if one of the prefects is getting a beating. So the developing nations, under the leadership of Alexander Kafka, nephew of the more famous Franz Kafka, who was the leader of the Brazilian delegation, basically combine and get the IMF governors to agree in September 1968 that conditionality applied to developing nations and developed nations will be the same. And this is really a function of Britain getting away with things in November 1967. Now, it's pretty obvious, as Charles said earlier on, that we're going to be back to the IMF in 1969 because the devaluation has taken an extra long time to feed through to a current account balance or surplus after devaluation. So we're going to go back to the IMF. Conditionality, we know, is going to be applied because of the standardisation conditionality in October 1968. So the IMF officials, Bank, Treasury and Central Statistical Office officials sit down in October 1968 to start thrashing out definitions. And this is the conference that is closely followed by an article in the Bank of England Quarterly Bulletin, written by Charles, and another article in Financial Statistics, the Treasury publication, which tries to claim that this is a British invention, which it was not. But the fact that domestic credit expansion, the IMF's own monetary aggregate, it is a British invention to the extent that it's a broader measure of DCM than the IMF is used to applying to countries like Brazil, Argentina. So it's conditionality, but with a British sort of broad money tinge. Now, this is the period. You'll notice that I haven't mentioned Milton Friedman once yet. This is the period that Milton Friedman actually possibly was quite influential within the UK authorities. When the IMF is coming to town in October '68 for this seminar with Treasury Bank and CSO officials, the Times, and I'm assuming Peter, you wrote this article, it was a Times editorial, but monetary policy might have been you. The Times writes an editorial saying Bank of England is and has for some time been making a close study of the whole question of the money supply. Well, they sort of had. They prepared papers for it's a 3-day conference, maybe a 4-day conference, with the IMF. But John Ford, chief cashier of the Bank of England, reads this article and says, well, actually, we haven't really developed our thinking, we were just preparing papers for the seminar. But maybe it is time, actually, that we had a major rethink on monetary policy, given there's so much going on in academia, there's so much going on, we're going to have to thrash out a position with the IMF. So what Ford does, with very high-level buy-in at the bank, is sets up the money supply group. And there are, Charles, correct me if I'm wrong, 4 key individuals in the money supply group: Charles Goodhart, recently arrived from the LSE, Andrew Crockett, Leslie Dixon-Rowan, I think Margaret, Now, this is not to be confused with the money study group, which is a more academic group. Now, people do confuse the money supply group, which is an internal bank group, with the money study group. Mustn't confuse those two things. The report of the money supply group is published in the Bank of England Quarterly Bulletin in June 1970. And the reason I say, so there's lots of things come together here. Peter writes an article in the Times, the IMF are in town, and they start doing econometric work on the money supply data that they've been ordered to collect by the Radcliffe report. So we've got broad money data produced and published in the Bank of England Quarterly Bulletin from 1963. And they regress that data on nominal incomes, and it looks like, as Andrew Crockett points out in April 1969, the conclusions of this piece of work are generally consistent with quantitative theory point of view as expounded by Friedman. And I think nobody's more surprised than the 4 people in the Bank of England, because the early papers of that, these are all in the Bank of England archive, the early papers are all, frankly, quite hostile to Friedmanism. And they find themselves, actually, there seems to be something in it. There does seem to be not only a correlation, but there seems to be some sort of causal link between the growth of M3 in the UK and nominal incomes. This provides some of the intellectual underpinning for the policy of competition and credit control in 1971. Now, there are lots of reasons for competition and credit control in 1971. That was, I would argue, the major reason why it was such a failed policy, because it meant different things to different people. For many bank officials, it was about getting rid of credit ceilings on bank lending, which was annoying the banks and proving difficult to govern, because it was just pushing lending out to the fringe, disintermediation. I think it was solved to the Conservative government has injected more competition. This is Ted Heath pre-U-turn, so it's all about more competition in the banking sector. But it's also because the Bank of England has published in the Bank of England Quarterly Bulletin in June 1970 a series of equations that seem to show that if you can predict the growth of the money supply, you can, with these reasonable, what look like reasonably stable equations, and you can control the growth of the money supply with the interest rate weapon, you can sweep away these ceilings on bank lending, which are just annoying everybody. So, we get, now, this is where, Michael, your definition of a money supply target earlier on, you very carefully used the word published. So I think you and I are going to disagree that this was a money supply target because it was non-published. So on the day of the National Growth Budget, which was actually, I think, the 21st of March 1972, the point at which Anthony Barlow stands up and says we're going to grow the British economy at 5% for the next 2 years, pretty much twice its long-term average speed. The governor and senior bank officials jump into the rolls, go out to the Treasury in a bit of a panic because they think this is going to cause inflation. So what they do is they impose a 20% internal, unpublished target on Anthony Barber, and he agrees to this. So there is an internal money supply target from 21st of March 1972. Now we can argue till the cows come home about how important this was, who was actually aware of this, was it influencing policy, perhaps something like that in discussion, but there is an unpublished target in place from 1972. Now we know what happens next. So here's the growth of M3 in 72 and 73, above 25%, and here's inflation a couple of years later. And I'm very much taking on board what James was saying last night, because this isn't exactly what Friedman said, but I think it sort of reflects the popular perception of Friedmanism that if you grow the money, if you allow the money supply to grow too quickly, then after a long variable lag, which at the time was generally thought to be, I think, about 18 months to 2 years, that will translate directly into inflation. William Rees-Mogg writes an article basically saying that in the Times in the early 1970s. Now this is maybe where I part company with Professor Congdon, because as Bill Allen, formerly of the bank, says, the events of 1971-75 which have been unique. There's no other episode, you wouldn't tell me the late 1980s possibly. Sure it is. Yeah, so, but he's writing in 83, so you can't have predicted what was going to come. But the events of 1971 clearly there was no other episode of UK monetary history in the last century with broad money so accurate prediction of future inflation. And the problem is, with all these carefully constructed demand for money equations break down. And this is not news, Charles has been saying this for 40 years because they were your equations. But they did break down in 1972. And the relationship that you thought you'd established between the growth of broad money and nominal incomes breaks down, never to be re-established. But I should get by with it. There is a relationship between retail and poor. Okay, so if the equations are broken down, and there is no relationship between the broad money supply and the growth of real macroeconomic variables like nominal income, why on earth is the Bank of England encouraging Dennis Healy to announce a published money supply target in July 1976, which he does, when he announces the 12% target? And this is only partly about monetary policy, and this goes back to the counterparts. It's the linkage between fiscal policy and monetary policy. Now again, I'm not going to read out all of that. Folks, I only need to read out the top part. This is Kit McMahon within the bank. If we can establish internally with the Treasury the principle of keeping the growth of money supply down and taking any necessary measures to that end, we will in due course get an extra lever on the Chancellor to attack public expenditure. It's not about controlling the money supply. Remember the counterparts. There are three essential counterparts. Is the growth of broad money coming from the public sector, the unfunded PSBR, which it was in 1975? Bank lending to the private sector is under control. The economy is not doing terribly well in 1975. There's no problem with the growth of bank lending in 1975. What McMahon is trying to do here, and what the bank is trying to do here, is through the medium of the credit counterparts, is trying to exert pressure on fiscal policy, which the bank has no mandate for, is trying to exert pressure on fiscal policy and get the Labour government's spending, or deficit spending, under control. Now, here's a quote from Anthony, which I think sums it up very nicely. The British monetary regime was not built on the back of the state equation model of money, which had broken down in 1972, rather considered intended to shackle the state spending bureaucracies. And I think that captures it very nicely indeed. I just put this up, so here's the first published one in July 76. Of course, that wasn't the first published M3 target in the UK. That came in the 1967 letter of intent, which said the UK government will try to keep the growth of broad money in 1968 lower than it has been in 1967. Again, we can argue about how much difference that actually made to policy, but we have a published M3 target in the letter of intent. It's all there in the documents. Here again, so here again, FTC targets, and here again, Stevens post-IMF targets, which he actually had a reasonably good record of hitting. Okay, so I'll start to wrap up. We're into the period of unbelieving monetarism. There is a myth out there that the money supply was only taken seriously when the IMF turned up in 1976. That is incorrect. Monetary policy was looser when the IMF left than what it was when they arrived. And that's because of the technical differences between M3, which includes foreign currency deposits, and sterling M3, which does not include foreign currency deposits. So the target before the IMF turned up was 12% on the broader measure. The target on the top of the target range when the IMF left was 13%, but on the narrower measure. And the Treasury, frankly, can't believe this lie. They can't believe they got away with this. The IMF was left having got the British government to agree that monetary policy could be looser than it was stated, that as was stated in the July measures. A couple of quotes there. I'll just focus on this one before I wrap up, because this takes us to the period of Charles' paper, which ends for emphasis. Because it's a very long, detailed paper, and if the equations showing the relationship between M3 and nominal incomes is broken down, why not focus on M1? And that's what the thrust of the paper is. And the conclusion is, well, perhaps you should have a joint M1, M3 target. And it's written after a very nice trip that you and John Ford had to Canada and the United States, where the Americans and the Canadians said, well, what on earth are you doing looking at broad money? This is impossible to control. What you should be doing is looking at the narrow monetary measure, because actually the equations survive, and the equations, the relationship between M1, the nominal incomes, does survive into the 1980s, and then that breaks down. But Bridgman at the Treasury is onto you straight away, because current accounts do and should react more quickly and more predictably when there's zero interest. They should and do react more quickly and predictably to changes in interest rate. And Bridgman is onto you straight away. This was basically a power grab by the bank to effectively get interest rate settled powers. I think I'm not going to talk about MTFS because lots of people who know much more about it than I do. But I'm just going to leave that slide up there because a number of people in the room who are all basically saying the same thing, stressing the policy continuity between the last 2 years of that Labour government and the first 2 years of the Thatcher government. And as Stratton said last night, and when he was sort of restating that comment that you made back in 2011, when you came to talk in Cambridge, we can think of the NTFS as the embodiment of the rejuvenated IMF framework. So that's my conclusion, really. I've hardly mentioned Friedman because, frankly, he wasn't terribly important. You don't see him in the documents. The IMF was important. Why? Because the IMF was writing the cheques. Milton Friedman was never writing checks to the British government, but the IMF was, and consistently. And just to, I promise I will finish it. If you go through the memoirs of the leading participants, I think Thatcher mentions Friedman 3 times in her memoirs, Lawson I think also 3 times, Howe once. Healy actually mentions him many more times. Just wasn't that important. The IMF was, and earlier than is usually happened.